Hello and welcome to week 10, where we're going to be talking about various approaches to data collection. So now you've all got your evaluation questions, or at least draft evaluation questions, and it's okay if those change as we go through the coming weeks, as we keep marching forward towards the different components of an evaluation plan. It's okay to make this an iterative process where you loop back and you look at your stakeholders and you look at your logic model. I'm actually going to mention that a few times today, so that's okay. But as we think about data collection, it's really beneficial to have one or two actual evaluation questions in mind. So starting from there, we're gonna jump right in. But before we do, just what we're going to cover in today's module is, first of all, an overview of what an evaluation plan is, since that is the option that almost all of you have chosen for your practicum report. Since that's coming up in a couple weeks now, I think it would be good for me to just talk through the different sections of what you'll actually end up writing in your evaluation plan, your practicum report, and also quickly touch on some resource documents which will be up in Scholar, which can guide you as you actually create your plan. Then the content of today is going to be talking about various ways of collecting data, including ways other than the survey, because the survey is what we often go to, but it's not the only way to collect data, not by a long shot. And then we're going to touch very briefly on mixed methods, but not very much because it's a whole subject in and of itself. We don't have time to go into it. And then we are going to talk about surveys because, for better or for worse, like I said, they're very, very common. And we're going to focus especially on this decision about whether you should find a pre-existing survey, adapt one that you found to meet your context, or to create your own homegrown survey. So to start with, especially for those of you who are doing evaluation plans as your practicum report, these are the sections of the document that you're going to create. Remember, it's not a very long document. It's only about 8 to 10 pages typed double-space, I believe is what it says in the syllabus. And already you've probably done what you need to do for parts A, B, and C, and possibly now D and E, although there's a little bit more you'll have to do with that. But just, and so again, I will post essentially a rubric, an evaluation plan rubric to Scholar along with this module, which has essentially the specific criteria for quality. So what is the high quality mission statement? What is the high quality program description, etc., etc. So in brief, the mission is just 2 or 3 very quick sentences that describe in a nutshell what is the mission of the program. What is it all about? Because any evaluation should be couched in that. You're not doing an evaluation plan for something that's just some random collection of activities. You're doing an evaluation plan which is in service of the ultimate mission of the program. So that's pretty brief. That's just an opening to your evaluation plan. Then the program description will be longer, possibly even up to a page or more. And if you want, this might be one place where you could cite some existing literature. Again, the evaluation plan is not like your average research paper. So that's actually going to be the research brief, which is due towards the very end of the semester, where you'll be doing a more traditional literature review and synthesis of the literature on a topic of your choosing. This is like a report that you would provide for a client if you, and many of you actually are doing evaluation plans for programs that you're involved in. So maybe you are the client yourself, but maybe your boss will want to see this, and think of them as the client. And so they might not necessarily want to see all sorts of literature on evaluation theory, or even on the theory of why you approach the program the way you do. But little bits of literature could come in, especially at the moment of the program description, and then I will get to it later on. But when you decide on what your data collection approach is, what your sample would be, etc., you might want to back that up with a little bit of literature to sort of provide your rationale for why you chose that approach and not some other approach. But the program description is basically all about describing the program. Go figure. And so you might want to say a little bit about the history of the program, so which touches on your life cycle decision. You notice there's not an actual section here where you can indicate what life cycle your program is in. But if it's a brand new program being offered for the first time, you would want to mention that here. If it's a program that's been around for decades, you might want to mention that here. And just really quickly touch on what the program is all about, who the key stakeholders are, and some things like that, which are laid out again in more detail in the rubric that's posted. Then the activities are taken pretty much wholesale from your logic model, and you can just list them out as a bulleted list. And I think that's it's kind of an addition to the program description. It paints the picture of what is the evaluand, what is being evaluated here. Then section D, the evaluation purpose statement, is very important, and it's, if you've ever written a journal article, or if you read journal articles, they're basically, the abstract is almost like a synopsis or a summary of the entire manuscript. That's what the evaluation purpose statement should be as well. It very clearly should state the purpose of the evaluation, and also talk a little bit about the methods that will be used that are laid out in greater detail in the plan. And here you can also talk about what the evaluation is not. So for instance, if you've chosen to only focus on participants who have been in the program for a certain number of years, or if you've chosen to only focus on short-term outcomes and not even touch the medium and the long-term outcomes, you can come right out and say that, and say, for this evaluation cycle, the scope of this evaluation is focusing on X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C are beyond the scope of this current evaluation, but we realize that that is something that we will evaluate at a future time. So those are things that can go into the evaluation purpose statement. It should probably be half a page or a page, it depends. Then the evaluation questions, as you saw from last week, are extremely important. It's kind of the heart of the matter. Everything you've done leads up to them, and then all your other decisions flow out from them. So you got to get the questions worded correctly. You've got to be sure that they are meeting your purposes. If I could just back up for a second. The evaluation purpose statement, this is actually a place where you can tie your plan into some of the earlier literature that we read on evaluation. So you don't have to say whether you're in the utilization focused or social justice branch or methods. If you want to, you can. But more importantly, if you think back to last week and the various purposes of evaluations, which are connected to the different types of evaluation questions, it could be really good for you to be explicit about that. For instance, are you doing an implementation evaluation for internal program improvement? Do you want to gather some data on how the program is being run so as to make it better? Is this an externally funded program where there is a strong accountability pressure? What is the purpose of the evaluation? I think, again, goes without saying, that's something that you should include in the evaluation purpose statement. So then the evaluation questions, that section is going to be pretty simple. It's not a lot of text, not a lot of writing. It's essentially just your evaluation questions if you have more than one, you can just put them as a numbered list with not too much text around them. Then the rest of the sections here, and this is where it's a bit tricky with these practicum reports, it's because I didn't want you to have to turn in your practicum the same day as you're turning in your research brief, because that would be a bit much. So that's why the practicum is due a few weeks earlier. But the problem with that is we're just now getting to measures, data collection, sample design, analysis, etc. So really, even if you wanted to get your project done ahead of time, you'd be kind of on your own, because you haven't had readings on some of these topics, you haven't had a module on them. So that's a tension that I realize can be a bit difficult, and I just, in the interest of spreading the work out and not having everything due at the end of the semester, that's why we're doing it this way. So today, these should actually, F and G should actually be switched there. We're going to talk, and I'll switch that in the document that's going to go up on Scholar. But after evaluation questions, you're going to talk about either your measures or your, I often prefer calling it data collection approach or data collection tools. So whether it's quantitative, qualitative, what have you, what are you going to do? What tool are you going to use to collect some data? Then once you've made that decision, as the reading suggests, though there's an iterative process back and forth between how you're going to collect the data, then who your sample has to be, and what your design is, which is again a concept that we saw last week, but we're going to delve into more in the coming weeks. And then, very importantly, you have to have an actual analysis plan in your evaluation plan. Very often, I see people who work really, really hard to come up with an excellent evaluation question, and maybe even come up with a specific data collection approach which is matched to each evaluation question. But then by the time they get to the analysis section of their plan, everything is kind of tapered off and gotten mushed together. So they say, we're going to do descriptive statistics on the numbers and thematic coding of the words, but without going into any more detail about, okay, well, which evaluation questions do those pertain to? What do you mean by that? So these sections, F, G, H, I, all build on each other, and again, there'll be more information posted on this and provided in next week's module as well. And then the last two sections, whether or not you find yourself in the utilization or the use branch, wouldn't it be nice if your evaluation actually served some purpose, if you're actually going to do this evaluation eventually? But wouldn't it be nice if your evaluation plan serves some purpose? If you don't have a plan for reporting the findings and sharing whatever you learn, then there's a lower chance that this evaluation will actually serve some purpose. So very often we think of reporting in terms of just a report, a Word document or a PDF that sits on someone's desk. But these days people are getting really creative with different ways of reporting, and we are going to touch on this towards the end of the semester. But just think about your community, think about who would be interested in the results of this potential evaluation. Maybe social media is in order, maybe some type of creative way of reporting the findings, maybe through a YouTube video or something like that. Who knows? It depends on what your evaluation purposes are and who your key stakeholders and audiences are. And then lastly, it's important to have a timeline for the entire evaluation plan. So from every step of the way, for instance, when you're going to develop the data collection tool, when you're going to pilot test the data collection tool, when you're going to send out the invitations to the participants, or before that, when you're going to get institutional review board approval so that you can then publish your findings later on. All of these things take time, and whether or not you're going to really do your evaluation, and that's going to be contained within this plan, I want you to create a timeline based on the calendar time, so starting from now, basically, and show, okay, roughly how many weeks out are you going to do step F? How many weeks out are you going to begin the data collection? How many weeks out are you going to begin doing the initial analysis? And that can just help you get real about the, it might be hard for you to know how much time some of these steps are going to take. The general rule of thumb is it does take longer than you expect. But I think that's a really good practical step, is to think through, okay, what is the timeline for this work? So, as I mentioned, there is this feedback form, and I actually have two versions of it. And this is a version that provides the general criteria of quality or success for each of those previous sections. Then I have a slightly more detailed version. I might share both of them as well, because they provide just slightly different perspectives. But my goal is to give you as much advanced warning about what is a good evaluation plan, so that as you sit down to do your plan, it's not a guessing game, but you know what I want, you know what constitutes a good plan, and you can do your best to get your plan in shape. I do have to say that many of you are already on your way to having a good plan, because you've done a really good quality logic model, You've done a really great boundary analysis, which essentially feeds into having a really solid program description. So some of those first sections are just checked off already, so that's good. So now for the rest of this module, we're going to be really focusing on getting data or getting to data. And this table here is a really, really helpful tool. And basically, for each evaluation question, before you jump to thinking about how you might measure it or what you're going to do, you have to be very clear on the construct. So what is the key idea? How it's defined. So if your construct is interest in science, well, what do you mean? What does that look like? How do you define interest in science? How do you know it when you see it? And then what sorts of tools might you need to capture it? So this is something that you can just on your own practice, thinking back to your evaluation question worksheet that you worked on for this past week. How can you extend that thinking into what sorts of tools you might need to capture it, to get at that data? So some overarching guiding questions for data collection. You always have to ask yourself, what information will be collected, from whom, when and how often, under what conditions, and if it's appropriate to ask, compared to what. So this is essentially what an evaluation design, or even a research design, is all about. So with the under what conditions, that basically gets at kind of, are you going to ask something of the entire group of participants, or are you going to sample from them? Is it going to be a pre and a post, or just a post only, which also gets at the frequency? And is there any reason to compare to some other group or to some pre-existing criteria, or are you just interested in learning about what's going on right then and there? Again, this harkens back to everything we talked about in the last module in terms of getting to good evaluation questions. So remember that there are multiple purposes for evaluation, and in the same sense there are multiple types of data that you might want to collect. For instance, you might have great evidence that your program is having some positive effect on participants, but you start to realize that maybe you're not reaching a diverse group of participants. So then the type of data that you would need is not outcome data, but it would be demographic or descriptive data. In a similar fashion, sometimes especially if you have a really early life cycle program, it might not be appropriate yet to look at outcomes and impacts. What you really need to look at is process data. How is this program being implemented? Do the facilitators have the necessary skills and knowledge to run the program, or the volunteers? And then very often you also want to look at outcome data. And then if it's feasible, you could look at all three of these types of data within the very same evaluation. Again, feasibility has to be a main concern, but if maybe you might end up with 3 evaluation questions. One gets at the demographics of your participants, one gets at the implementation or the process, and one gets at the short or medium term outcomes to allow you to make some claims about the longer term impacts of your program eventually. Then this is probably a distinction you know. It's a pretty important distinction. Are you going to be focusing on qualitative data or quantitative data? They each are valuable. They each allow you to make different claims and to gain different insights about your program. And then, as I said in the introduction, we are going to talk briefly about mixed methods, which really means the strategic or intentional mixing of both qualitative and quantitative data within the same evaluation or within the same research study. And then this is getting in a little bit to research methods, and we don't really need to dwell on this, but this is also on Bill Trosham's Research Methods Knowledge Base, which we began the semester reading from. There's actually a lot of great stuff up there on just basic research methods, so If you're ever bored and want to learn more about research and evaluation, you can go back to that website. But this is, maybe you've come across this, especially if you've taken a quantitative analysis class or quantitative measurement class. There are different types, or what we call levels of data, and there are implications for how you analyze them. So a nominal variable or nominal data would be something which is separated just by name only. So the only difference between the things or the phenomena out there are just names. So if for some reason your evaluation question was, what are people's favorite colors? And so then you might come up with a survey where you ask the participant, what is your favorite color? They would say blue, yellow, green, what have you. That's nominal data, because the difference between the different potential answers is just different names. You know, what animals do you like? The relationship is that they're all animals, but there's not some specific difference between the animals or the colors. Then ordinal is just like it sounds. It's data that is a little different because it's actually it's in order. So if you have a question about asking people to rank their preference for something, they're answering you by putting something in order. But it doesn't say anything about the level of space between the different options. And often, very, very often, we're going to talk a lot about surveys today, you'll see Likert scales, and the various options that are offered may or may not seem like there's an equal amount of distance between the different options. Like, what if you have a question and the responses are super duper great, mediocre, and terrible? Well, is that the same level of difference between the possible answers as super duper great, really, really great, pretty great, and great? People actually do that, just come up with the most random types of response options. But they're ordinal in that you can put them in an order, but you can't say anything about the distance between them. Then in an interval level of data, you do know something about the distance between the different potential responses, but it's not some absolute value. So a lot of data are interval, but then the last type is ratio, where not only is there a known and equal interval between the different response options or the different variables, there's also some absolute zero. So age would be an example of a ratio. The difference between a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old in quantitative age is the same as between a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, right? 365 days. And it's a ratio because it starts at 0. So a 4-year-old is twice as old as a 2-year-old. With temperature, actually, it works with the Kelvin scale because Kelvin has absolute 0. But it doesn't work with the Fahrenheit scale because 0 is just relatively arbitrary in Fahrenheit. So anyway, we digress. These are probably levels of detail that you don't have to go into. But it does, if you get really into survey data and you want to analyze your survey very carefully and get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, the reviewers might critique you if you're analyzing the data, if you're analyzing ordinal data as if it were ratio data. So how do we collect data? There are lots and lots of different ways of collecting data, and forgive me if you've been to a professional development workshop with me and you've probably seen some of this information, but this can be a good refresher. So often we think of surveys, which are the third option here, but there's all sorts of other ways. I pulled these examples from an excellent resource from Ellen Taylor Powell, who used to work with cooperative extension in University of Wisconsin. But for instance, you can maybe people had to fill out some form when they started your program, or maybe there's some administrative data that's gathered on people. Well, that's existing information. Don't bother them by asking them again. You can just mine the existing information you have. Maybe observation is a really good way to collect data. You come up with a rubric or an observational protocol, and then, of course, you always want to think about the ethics of the situation. And do the people need to know that you're observing them and collecting data on them? Or can you do it kind of anonymously? And when is that okay and when is that not okay? Case study is where maybe, there's 3 or 4 programs that are interesting to you, and you pick one of them and you just go really in depth. You do interviews and you do observation, you do document analysis, where the unit of analysis becomes that case, that program, or that organization. Of course, interviews can be great, focus groups as well, all sorts of different examples of data collection. Now, unobtrusive measures is also really good because everyone out there, including you get tired of having data collected on you. You don't want, you have what we call survey fatigue or just data collection fatigue in general. So there are ways, like with using existing information, where you might be able to collect data that is helping you then answer your evaluation question in ways that you don't even have to bother people. So one example that I always like using is there was a marketing company that wanted to figure out what were the popular radio stations in a town. Well, they could have done a very expensive and time-consuming telephone survey where they get a list of everyone in the town and they do a random sample and they call people and they ask, what radio station do you like? Well, to be less obtrusive and also cheaper, more economical, what they did instead was they went to the local mechanic shops and they asked the mechanics to just note down every time that a car comes into the shop what station the radio was set to. And then voila, you have unobtrusive data on what radio stations people are listening to. Now, anything like that, just like with any data collection approach, you do have to be cognizant of potential biases that come in. So for instance, with that example, you might be undersampling people who fix their own cars, or people who have cars. You might be oversampling people whose cars break down a lot, who might be in a different socioeconomic class, essentially, than people whose cars break down less. So one way to get around that is, since everyone has to get their inspection sticker done, you could have them just collect the data when people come in for inspection, because that you could make the argument that that is a more representative sample. So you see, even with unobtrusive measures, you are not immune to threats to validity and reliability, which is something we'll talk about later too. Regardless of what data collection approach you choose, these are some overarching questions that you should always ask yourself. And they overlap a bit, but they really emphasize don't just pick something by random. You gotta pick something that is right for the job, that fits the program life cycle, that is good for your sample group, that fits into the program setting, that will provide results that speak to key stakeholders, and that's feasible and has strategic value. So many of these overlap, but for instance, what do we mean by feasible and fitting into the program setting? Well, this is actually a true story. I came across a youth development researcher who looked to 4-H, which is the youth development program of cooperative extension, as a great source of young research subjects. So she had some survey that had been published in a peer-reviewed journal. It had established scores for validity and reliability. It looked like a great tool, and but the problem was that it was like 100 items long. So if you picture maybe a 3-hour environmental education program where the young people are out in the woods, they're getting muddy, it's getting cold, it's getting dark, and then you want them to fill out this 10-page, 100-question survey. Does that fit the setting? It might be windy. The wind might be blowing the survey away. Is it going to fit the setting? Is it going to work with a sample group, or is it going to be so problematic that any data that they give on the survey is going to be totally questionable and of low quality? So these are questions to always keep in mind. And then lastly, there's the all-important question of quality, which I just got at a little bit in that last story, but quality of the measure has to be balanced against all of these other questions that come before. So if you notice in the text, there's, especially in quantitative evaluation, the two most dominant notions in terms of the quality of a data collection tool are validity and reliability. Now, just as a refresher, validity has to do with how well the tool measures what it is supposed to be measuring. So it's like, how well does the arrow hit the center of the target? Then reliability is how well the measure repeats itself or gets similar scores time after time. So that could be like, you might be missing the target, but you keep clustering your arrows in the same spot. That would be a metaphor for reliability. So if I have a scale that tells me that I weigh 125 pounds, that when every day I weigh myself, it tells me that same thing. That scale would have excellent reliability, but unfortunately very poor validity. So also, regardless of your data collection approach or tools that you choose, it's very important to pilot test the measure to see if your measure is doing what you think it's going to do. Can you get the thumbs up from the pilots? So again, regardless of the tool, these are some general approaches you could take before you go out and start collecting data on your actual people. What you should do is find a few people from a similar group, then try to make the situation seem as much like your actual data collection approach as possible. Have them fill out the survey or participate in the focus group or fill out the reflective journal or whatever it is you're doing to collect data, and then just have a conversation with them and try to figure out, first of all, how long did it take them to go through that data collection experience? What did they think each item was about? You might have a question that seems clear to you, but then you have someone take it. This could be a colleague or maybe some past participants in your program or something like that. And then they fill out the survey or whatever, and then they say, okay, so what do you think I meant by number 3 here? They might come back with a totally different interpretation from what you meant. And that means that before you unleash the survey on people, you should go back and fix it and try to get it to be a little bit more valid and reliable. So here are some other great questions you can focus on as you pilot. And remember, when I mentioned the timeline, you should work in enough time to pilot the measure or the data collection approach so that you're getting good data and not questionable quality data. So unfortunately, mixed methods as a topic is beyond the scope of this module, but just a couple points on this topic. One is that mixed methods have become extremely popular, and I think that's a good thing because oftentimes when we're dealing with complex phenomena like the programs that you're all running out in your various communities, one type of data, quantitative or qualitative, is often insufficient to get a full picture of what's going on. So having numbers about the program or the people in the program, that could be very helpful. That could tell you some really great things. Having stories or words about what's going on, that can also be helpful and really good. But if you add them together, you can learn even more. You can gain some insights about the effectiveness of your program or the implementation of your program, which you may have missed if you had only used one method or the other. Now, unfortunately, as mixed methods have become more popular, they've also been used really just loosely. So just because you're collecting some numbers and some words does not really mean you're doing a mixed method study. And this is what we don't have time to go into. But if you think back to the different philosophical assumptions, I know you thought you were done with those, but they keep coming back. I told you, you're never completely done with them. So the quantitative approach to data collection is tacitly or implicitly making some epistemological and ontological assumptions about how that tool can know about the world. And an interview where you're asking people to tell you, what did you think about the program? Did this program help you? Did it improve your life in some way? Well, that approach to data collection, that methodology, has different epistemological and ontological assumptions. So when you mix data, you don't have to go crazy with it, but when you're mixing qualitative and quantitative data, it's really important to be thoughtful about the philosophical or the theoretical implications for how you're doing that mixing. Are you mixing paradigms? Or are you just mixing data? Are you mixing analytical tools? What are you mixing and how are you doing it? So I would actually suggest that a mixed methods design is going to be appropriate for many of your practicum reports. And if you do that, don't get scared, but as you do the mixing, I'll try to actually post a few resources on this either this week or next, that in case you want to do mixed methods, you can have some more guidance on it. But you can always also try to meet with me during office hours, and we can talk a little bit more about the implications for mixing methods. Hopefully I haven't scared you away, because really I think it's a great evaluation approach. Then we get to surveys, which are the most common animal in the biodiversity of data collection approaches. And surveys are also something that many of us know, not just because we administer them to people, but because we have filled out countless surveys in our own lives. Sometimes this is what it feels like. It's survey after survey after survey. That's part of, just like the textbook was saying, this is kind of part of the world that we live in now. So since you yourself have filled out numerous surveys, you know which are the parts that drive you crazy. And if there's something that drives you crazy in a survey, and then you sit down to create your own survey, please don't repeat those mistakes, and please try to make a better survey. So just think for a second right now, when you sit down to fill out a survey, whether it's online or with a pen and paper, what are the survey designs that really bother you? There are many. Here are just a few. So, first of all, there's just too many surveys. So there should be fewer surveys generally. It's a waste of my time. Surveys that have typos in them or that are really badly formatted, don't do that. One of the worst things is, you read the question, you look at the response options. You have to pick from one of their options, but none of those options fit the answer you want to give. That's the point when I close the tab on the survey or just walk away. Maybe they might be asking personal or prying questions that you don't feel are appropriate for them to ask. Maybe they're asking leading questions or badly phrased questions. Maybe they said it would take 5 minutes and now you're 25 minutes in and still don't know when the survey is going to end. There's more that we're going to get to in a second. But here are the golden rules of survey design. Number 1, respect your respondent. This has a lot to do with what language you choose, whether you tell them what the survey is about ahead of time and thank them and act nice to them, even in the written survey. Secondly, don't ask any items or questions of the participants on your survey if they don't map onto one of your evaluation questions in some way. Don't ask things just because it's nice to know or just because every survey has that. Like with demographic information. If you're throwing demographic questions like race, ethnicity, gender, age, all that stuff onto a survey, but none of your evaluation questions actually require knowing about demographics for any of your analysis plan, then don't bother them with it. Take it off. Then also, any data you're collecting, this is why actually having an evaluation plan is so good, because you should think ahead. Okay, if I send the survey out and I get the data back, then what? What am I going to do with it? How, if people answer this question correctly, even, or like following the instructions, what am I going to do with it? Then pilot test, as I've already said. That's very important. So these are just a number of ways that you can respect your respondent. Use clear, well-worded language. Don't use acronyms or jargon. Indicate what type of response you're looking for. So say, for instance, check all that apply, or circle the word that most relates to you. Don't just throw the question and the answer out there, but give them some instructions to help them. Be sure that the responses cover all possibilities. Try to imagine that your respondents will be diverse and will have different perspectives. Don't ask anything you don't need to. Be very nice. Ask, would you consider participating in this survey? Tell them what it's for. Is this for program improvement? Is it going to be anonymous? Tell them as much as you can without writing a whole paragraph at the beginning. But then thank them. Be nice. Give them your contact info. Be culturally thoughtful. So don't use outdated categories that limit the cultural responsiveness or appropriateness of the survey. And then especially if this is going to be used for public use, you have to get Institutional Review Board approval. And all of this can get you high quality data. And in the absence of all this, you have low quality data. So this, I think we've already talked about. Each item on the survey should be mapped onto or matched with at least one of your evaluation questions. Think ahead for analysis. If you're going to have, are you asking yes/no questions when really you want more of a scale? Or are you asking a scale when really it could be yes/no? Is it nominal, ordinal, or interval or ratio data? Why are some items close-ended, like with a Likert scale type of response, and why are some open-ended? What are you going to do with that at the level of analysis and interpretation? One we haven't gotten to, but is also the notion, and I see this all the time, the notion of double-barreled questions. So that's two questions packed into one, where if a person wants to answer yes to the first question and no to the second question, but it's all rolled into one question, then they get very frustrated because it's another way of making the response options not match people's response. So one reason why pilot testing is important is because people will always interpret your questions differently than you thought they would. So this little example here, oftentimes if you want to have a pre-survey and a post-survey where you know that the same person, you want to match the pre-post with the post-test. You want to match the pre-test with the post-test, rather. That you can actually do some really strong analysis if you do that. But if it's supposed to be an anonymous or a confidential survey, you can't have people writing their name on the top of it. So often you come up with these prompts to have people develop unique identifier codes. So in this real-life example, the prompt to have people generate their unique identifier code was enter the last letter of your first name, your birth month, and your 5th grade teacher's last name. And so this is what actually people came up with, which is just kind of a random stringing together of letters and words. And that is not going to help the people administrating this survey. So if they pilot tested it ahead of time, they would have realized, oh, we need a different way to deal with this pre-post matching issue. So, as I mentioned at the outset, one of the most fundamental decisions, especially if you're going to use a survey, is whether you should find a pre-existing survey from the literature, or whether you should, and then just use it wholesale, just take it right off the shelf and use it in your program, or whether you should find a pre-existing survey and then adapt it and tweak it to meet your context, or whether you should just sit in your office and write your own survey, your own homegrown data collection tool. So here's a little bit of a decision tree to help you wade through this decision about whether to find, adapt, or write. If you have people who are able to look for existing measures, then, if you have people who have the capacity and the time to create a high quality original measure, go ahead and do that, probably. If you don't, then look at the system. If you're in youth education or 4-H, look to 4-H for existing measures, which I'm going to mention in a little bit. If you're doing an IPM program or a pest management program, look to the literature to see, is there a measure of knowledge of pest management practices? Then you don't have to create your own because there's one that's already out there. I mentioned the Netway, again, that's that software that one of the things it can do is help produce pathway models, but it's also a kind of a library of different measures. So that's one way you can go if you're looking for pre-existing measures. Then there's a whole bunch of scenarios where having a pre-existing measure is probably beneficial. For instance, if you want to make a really strong claim about effectiveness, if some stakeholders are for some reason putting a value in a measure that has already an established validity and reliability scale, if your evaluation question is focusing on a contentious and complex construct, if you want to compare the evaluation results on your program with other results across the state, across the country, across the world, in those cases, it's usually best to find a pre-existing measure, if you can. So that would be the result right there. You find and use a pre-screened, oftentimes published measure, which, by the way, sometimes you actually have to pay for. So that's another feasibility concern. If you can't find a measure, and if you have staff or volunteers who can keep searching, you do that. If you don't have the staff with the time and skills to keep searching, then either you're out of luck or you call me and I'll try to help you. If you found a measure, a pre-existing measure, but it's 100 items long and your program, that's not feasible for your program, maybe there are just parts of it that you can take. Maybe you take the first 10 questions. But you have to realize, though, that if you adapt a pre-existing tool, it no longer has the same validity and reliability as it started with. So it still has something going for it, and maybe it has some strategic importance to do that. But you have to realize that once you change it, it no longer has the same scores on the quality metrics as a measure as it did before. So then if you've got the staff able to adapt that measure, then they do it. If you don't have that, then you're out of luck again. Or you can call me and I'll help. So just really quickly, this is a little bit of a comparison of the trade-offs between finding, modifying, and writing your own measure. There are different implications for the validity and the reliability. Of course, as we laid out, the pre-existing measures are going to have the highest reliability and validity. Oh, I forgot to mention, though, here, let me pause here. A really important point from the text that I don't want to miss is validity and reliability are fundamentally quantitative concepts, and you may have noticed that they kind of have a corollary or a synonym in qualitative evaluation. So validity in qualitative, you would talk more about credibility, or is this a believable measure of what we're trying to get at? Is this are these interview results credible? Are they believable? And then reliability is kind of synonymous with dependability. So if we have someone doing an observation in Roanoke, and then someone else, a different person, using the same observation tool, qualitative observation tool, in Richmond, can we count on the fact that those qualitative data are going to be more or less the same? So these questions of validity and reliability, even though we use these quantitative-driven terms, it applies to any type of data collection. Then these other variables you have to think about: does it fit your context? Is it expensive? Is it good at getting at a complex construct like empowerment or freedom or democracy or whatever construct you're looking at. Who knows? So this is just a quick example here, but since many of you actually are 4-H agents or working in the 4-H system, this is a nice little system-wide approach to an issue in evaluation which I've seen for years and years, which is that when you're collecting data and there are pre-existing or validated measures, it's really good to use those measures, but also use them in a way that so it's standardized at a certain level so the data can be aggregated and shared, but it's also able to be adapted or localized. So in the 4-H system, they actually have measures called the common measures, and that allows for standardization at the state or regional or even national level based on common core outcomes, which are all connected to the plan of work at the national level or even the logic model at the national level. So, maybe we don't need to create our logic models for each county level program. I think we still do, because by doing your own logic model, that's really engaging everyone in evaluative thinking, where just using someone else's pre-existing model or using the federal logic model does not get you doing evaluative thinking. However, even though you're thinking at the local level, it's good to connect to these larger levels of the system and get those benefits of being part of a larger system. So they've come up with these common measures, and other systems have this as well, but this is just one that I'm familiar with and starting to work with a little bit more. So you see the different measures. There's one on citizenship, one on healthy living, one on science, one that's sort of more general positive youth development, and they have them for 2 age groups, 4th grade and 8th grade. Here's what it looks like. It's actually a pretty well formatted survey, and it's also available on Qualtrics, which anyone affiliated with Virginia Tech should have access to, and it's a way to basically collect survey data online. It's quite a good tool. So now, just to wrap up, and we're not going to go through all of this because I've noticed this is a long module, but one of the things about writing good surveys or even collecting good data is being able to critique other people's data. That's part of the game. So here's a little game, and I'll just show a few of these before we end, but it's the what's wrong with these questions. So I'm going to put up an item from a survey, and I'm going to give you a minute or two to think through what is wrong with this question. So it says, when you go out to eat, which type of food do you most prefer? American, Italian, Chinese, other. So at least they give you other as an option, in case one of those 3 options doesn't fit for you. But what do you do if you don't ever go out to eat? Right? What if you're saving your money or you don't like restaurants? How would you answer this? It's question 1 on the survey. If you can't answer question 1, you're probably going to rip up the survey or close the tab and just give up. So here's the answer. A respondent that never goes out can't answer it, and above all, the answer categories have to be relevant for the respondent. Here's another one. Because I'm tired, it's a bad excuse. This is actually a double-barreled question, which I talked about earlier. Did today's workshop provide you with information to review and, if necessary, improve your ability to evaluate your program? So how would I answer if the workshop provided me with information to review? Yes, but it didn't provide me with information to improve the evaluation of my program. Do I say yes or no? I'm kind of stuck there. So here you see they've dealt with the double-barreledness of it, and they've changed the yes or no into more of a range. So we could go on and on with these, but what I'm going to do is just, if you want, you can go through this on your own using the slides, which will be posted along with this module, because I have quite a few of them. You can bring this home and play it as a game on the weekend, right? Evaluation board games. We should really develop one of those, actually. Whoever develops an evaluation board game gets extra credit. I'm serious. Okay, well, so that's the data collection module. As you see, there's lots of different ways to collect data. There's good ways and bad ways. There's a lot to think about with this. Remember those overarching questions of, does it fit your life cycle? Does it fit your purposes? Whatever data collection approach you choose, you should be able to back it up. And in your evaluation plan, that is something that I would expect you to do, to provide a little bit of rationale about why you chose one way and not another way. You know, why interviews and not focus groups, or why focus groups and not interviews. Oh yeah, and that reminds me, one other thing about your evaluation plan is most of you have really high quality logic models already, so you should include your logic model as an appendix in your eventual evaluation plan. And then also, you should include your data collection tool as an appendix also. So even if it's just in draft form, maybe you haven't really pilot tested it or anything, but you should include it, because if you're saying, I'm going to do a survey to collect data on this EQ, well, you can't just say you're going to do a survey. I got to see what items you're going to, I want to see a draft of that survey. And that will go into also the evaluation of the quality of your plan. So that is that. Definitely get in touch with me if you have any questions. And again, look for the other resources that will be posted here along with this module to guide you in your work as you decide on your evaluation data collection approach. And then the readings for next week focus on sampling and a few other factors. So that'll be chapter 11 and 12, and then a paper by some people who some of you may know, Hoffman, Boyd, and Franz. So have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you soon.